Hey guys, what is up? Unrested here, and I'm back with a couple more creepy stories for you. And today I'm going to be doing it referencing a show that was on Netflix called Juon, or The Grudge Origins. Now, I'm going to be honest with you, in the past, a lot of the Juon movies haven't been that great, aside from maybe the first and the second one were pretty decent. The American adaptations, especially the one they made in 2020, that was real bad. As well as the girl in white and the girl in black, and then Juon versus the Ring Ghost with Sadako versus, I forget what the Juon girl's name is, but that is bad. Like, those were horrible movies. But out of nowhere, Netflix comes out with Juon Origins, and I thought, like, oh boy, here we go again, another bad movie. And then I saw it was a TV show, and I was like, it's a series? Okay, that's weird. So my wife and I sit down, we're like, we'll give one of them a chance. They're like 45 minutes long. And guys, it is top tier horror. It is amazing. I don't know who took over for the storytelling for this series, but they did a magnifique job. Like, it is incredible. If you haven't seen it already, I don't want to spoil anything I'm about to talk about. I want you to go ahead and watch it, stream it, however you need to do it, whether you need to borrow somebody else's passcode to watch Netflix, watch it. If you're here for Osoroshi Saturday and you love scary things from Japan, watch it. But one thing I do want to do is say, if you have watched it, there's a lot of stuff in it that is based on true things that have actually happened in Japan. And I've written down a bit of a list, and this list is also borrowed somewhat from a channel called Tara Devlin. She does a series called Kawabana, where she talks about scary stories from Japan. Excellent channel. If you haven't already checked hers out and you love Osoroshi Saturday, then her whole channel is just like one nonstop Osoroshi Saturday. She does a far better job and has far better research and Japanese reading skills than me. Excellent channel. Got to give it a shout out. I've watched it for ages now. But some of the things, as I watched the series that came out, I noticed, I thought, wow, these are all things that are actually from Japan, that are true, like, kind of horror stories. And are they referencing this? Why? And as I started to watch the series, I started to realize, oh, they're trying to say that almost every scary thing that has happened, or every kind of curse, or every kind of bad thing has originated from this house. Hence the name Juon Origins. Duh, Scott. I mean, come on. But I want to go through each of those, and these are each things that you can individually look up as well and do more research on if you want. Some of them I've even covered in the past that were, very scary situations. We are going to get into some truly real, like, news reading horror and murders. So if that's too triggering for you, I understand. Come back when it's not based in true crime and the reality of the true horrors that humans can actually do. I try to stick to mostly real stories, or stories that have at least some truth wound or laced into them. And that's kind of what we're doing here. Everything here is 100% real, I guess. It's really existed is the best I can do. I don't know, you can be on the border as far as the supernatural aspects are concerned, but let's get into it. Number one, the Yellow House. If you guys don't already know, the whole idea of the Juon house is based on a house called the Yellow House. Sometimes I've heard it called the Senkaku House, which means like triangle house, which I don't think they mean it was actually built in the shape of a triangle. It was built on a road that diverged into two paths, putting it in the middle of a triangle, if that makes sense. This house apparently had all sorts of problems, that everybody who moved into it had some sort of massive tragedy happen to their family. Even later, when it was shut down as a house and they tried to turn it into a fruit stand, the fruit stand went bankrupt. The family totally lost all their money. Let me go just into a little bit of it. The first family that moved in here, that first got the Senkaku house, or the Yellow House, whatever you want to call it, it was a husband and a wife. The wife was a stay-at-home mom. The husband was a guy who went to work every day, a salaryman, typical Japanese family. This is pretty traditional. But apparently he was staying later and later at the job, and started to have an affair with someone at his job, which meant he was cheating on his wife, and she was pregnant at the time too. They were supposed to be starting a happy family future in this Yellow House, and instead he kind of, completely messed all that up by cheating on his wife with someone at work. When his boss found out, he was fired, and also his wife found out later after that, so he was kicked out of the job, and now he's not making any money. Baby's on the way. Couple is constantly fighting because the woman is stuck at home due to pregnancy. She can't go out and get work to earn money for her child or her family. She was depending on the husband to do that, which is a pretty traditional Japanese way. But he had just lost his job, and now they're about to have a kid with a brand new mortgage, with a brand new life and mouth to feed, and no money coming in. And she found out he was unfaithful. So fights burst out into this house, hardcore, and apparently it ended up in a murder-suicide where the baby was killed, the wife was killed, and the husband killed himself at the end. And that apparently is what laid the curse on this house. Another family moved in there where it was a young son taking care of a older mom. So I say young son, he was probably like 30 years old, and the mom is like up in her 80s, and he's supposed to be taking care of her, and it ends up murdering her instead. They ended up bickering all the time and fighting. They said before these two moved into the house, they never had any fights. He was a loving son who always took care of his mom, and there was never any problems. She was a person with needs who was like in her upper years and with a couple of disabilities due to that. And when he was supposed to be taking care of her, he was apparently just getting drunk all day in the house, spending her Social Security checks. And when she finally caught him doing so, they got into a fight, which ended up with, once again, the grandmother is murdered. The mom is murdered, and the son commits suicide, another suicide murder. Finally, it was taken over, like I said, by a couple who owned a fruit stand. They apparently went completely bankrupt and committed suicide in the house. And that was the yellow house. Like, there's so many bad things that went down on it. Apparently cursing it, to this day, I've heard that it's actually been torn down and that the area, just like nothing is built there anymore. They even tried to like put a parking lot there, and it just also went bankrupt and didn't make any money. No one would park there just because I guess it had that Juon or Grudge on it from the spirits that had, I guess, been burned into the fabric of the area. I don't know how you would address that. It's called a Shinrei point in Japan, which means like a point in which ghosts haunt, and it became that forever. So there's like a lot of news stories too. While you're watching the Juon Origins show, the TV is usually on in the background, and there were a few I knew, like the sarin gas attacks. If you don't know, the cult called the Omri Shikrio. Omri Shikrio, I hope I got that right. I probably didn't. Shinrikyo, that's what it's called, the Shinrikyo, okay, which means like the new light or something, like it's something crazy. And if you don't know, that was led by this blind cult leader, and when I say blind, I mean like he was physically blind, and he had his followers believing that they were going to start the new world post-apocalypse. And you're thinking, well, there hasn't been an apocalypse in the world. What are you talking about? They were going to create their own apocalypse. And the way that they were going to do this was by putting sarin gas into the subways of Japan. And they did this in Tokyo. If you're wondering how they snuck this gas onto there, well, apparently a lot of super intelligent scientists had started this cult, which just goes to show you it doesn't matter how smart you are, you can become a cult member. And they had actually created the sarin gas in a liquid form that, when let into the air, it would evaporate just by room temperature. They put it into plastic bags. They covered the plastic bags in newspaper. They dropped them down into the floor of many subway stations that they were riding, had an umbrella that had a point on the end of the umbrella poked into the newspaper and the plastic bags, and slowly but surely the gas started to release. Now, when that gas releases, they have time to get out of there before they're affected by it. But I mean, this had devastating effects, guys. This is a really sad situation where people were left with nerve damage. People died. So many people died. I think it was something like 38 different people died, and multiple people were left with nerve damage. You had like some of the saddest things to see from this is there was like teenagers who were on that train when that happened. And to this day, like, they're paraplegic because they had so much nerve damage from the sarin gas being released. They never got to get a job, start a family, and they were in college at the time. And because of this idiotic cult, many lives were ruined. The guy went to jail. He's actually recently been put to death. I think in 2020 he was put to death. And it's still to this day the cult exists, which is really weird. I'm surprised Japan lets it go on. And his daughter is the one leading the cult now, and she says that the US military was the one that released the gas. She's trying to blame them, but I mean, it's just insanity. The whole cult is insane. The members were on the run for the longest time ever, and most of them have been caught now. I think there's probably still a few missing, but they might have already committed suicide in the Aokigahara forest. So anyway, moving on from there, in 1988, the next one you see is a story on the news in the background about a girl who was found in concrete. And this is another devastating story and serious trigger warning. Like, this is a story that even really bothered me when I read about it. It's the furuta junko murder story. And if you don't know about her murder, it's one of the most horrendous, disgusting murders. She was a girl who was pretty much kidnapped from her high school by other high school boys who were going there at the time. They spent months, about 3 months, absolutely torturing this poor girl by like putting cigarettes out on her body, dropping weights on her chest, raping her multiple times a day, burning her with lighters and matches. And I can't go through too much of it, or I start to remember the whole case, and it's honestly a triggering case to read about. I highly, even if you are a true crime fan and you like to research these things, I highly warn you against looking up anything on this unless you've got a very strong mind and stomach. This was a very unsettling case, and in this movie they make it as something that's playing on the news in the background, which also connects it to this house because it's playing on a TV. And apparently one of the places that she tried to run away to with the boys when they first kidnapped her, or they didn't kidnap her, they actually like tricked her into traveling around with them and eventually brought her back to one of the boys' houses. But they involve the house in this story to add that into it. Let's see, the next one we got here is in 1995, there was the Great Hanshin earthquake. And God, I still remember my wife telling me stories about this earthquake. This was one of Japan's most devastating earthquakes ever. I mean, if you go back and look at pictures and footage of this earthquake, you will be blown away by how devastating it was. We're talking massive buildings, massive structures in a country where a lot of the stuff is built literally around earthquakes were toppled. Entire highways knocked over, entire train systems completely derailed and trains off the tracks. Hundreds of thousands killed in this devastating earthquake. It was so sad to see and look up footage on this. And I remember all sorts of stories coming out afterwards from this, of people who were getting phone calls from people who were either already trapped in the earthquake or people who had died in the earthquake, and for some reason they were getting phone calls from the dead people. Now, of course, some people have connected this with, phones being activated by having like stuff drop on top of them, or them, having some sort of strange connectivity due to the fact that like they're pressed down by the bodies that have landed on top of these phones. I think there's been even one situation in America where a train that derailed, a person got 13 phone calls from one of the passengers who had died on that, and apparently it was because of the way his body was thrown when the train went off the rails that it connected his phone, and he started calling a bunch, and they wondered how they had gotten 13 different phone calls from a dead person. There was stuff like that that happened all over Japan, and one of the phone calls that comes in to the house is from someone who's died in this earthquake. Next up is the 1997 Kobe child murders. Ugh, this is another nasty one where I don't suggest you get too deep into it unless you really want to read a pretty gruesome crime. I always feel like Japan is 0 to 100 when it comes to true crime. Either there's a completely safe area and Japan is 100% safe all the time, or they find a murderer and the murderer just goes to the most extreme levels possible. Like, it's not like they murdered in desperation or out of an act of passion. It was just done to be a complete and utter disgusting psychopath. And this is exactly what it was with the child murders. It was also, I think, called the otaku murders because the guy who did it was a hikikomori, or an otaku for anime and stuff. And he was really into like this very underground boy play, as they called, which is like map-based anime and manga. I don't know a lot about it, not something I want to look into or research, but you can probably put one and one together to make how too gross this absolutely is. And he was apparently picking up, raping, and killing little boys who were coming home from elementary school, which is completely horrifying due to the fact that I myself have two young boys who come home from elementary school every day. Luckily, we have a huge police presence in the area that I'm at. This happened in an area that was very inaka, which means like countryside, so he was able to get away with this without any sort of surveillance. There wasn't any CCTV back in 1995, so he killed these kids, and to, I guess, gloat about the horrific acts he did, he took two of the different kids' heads, chopped them off, and put them on the fence of the school to, I guess, permanently traumatize and horrify everyone involved in this case. And still to this day, I mean, reading about that case it really reaches the levels of what my mind can take as far as researching some of this stuff. So be very careful with any of these. Number 3, it's called The Phone Incident, and they don't have a date connected to this one. And this one was actually one I had never heard of. This was a really strange one. So there's a part, and I guess spoiler alert if you haven't watched the show yet, but there was a part where a man returns home to his wife who is pregnant, and he's been cheating on her the whole time. He's a pretty evil character in the show. And when he gets there, her stomach has been ripped open, and he's hearing a phone ringing, and he realizes the phone is coming from within her stomach. And he looks into like the open womb or cavity or whatever you want to call it, and the phone's been buried into her pregnant stomach, her empty womb. I don't know what you say for that situation. I mean, I'm almost getting far too graphic. I'm sure this video is going to be almost struck down by YouTube, but there's a phone buried into her empty womb, and this actually happened in Japan. There was a man who was murdering people, and one of his calling cards was to like bury technology into his victims. And this guy buried a phone into the woman's stomach that he killed one time after ripping her baby out. And later they found the killer, but he had already killed himself. And the man in this story, he kills himself by hanging himself, and like all the fluids are leaking out of his body. It's a pretty disturbing scene. And apparently when they found the guy who had been doing these crazy murders, he was dead in the same way, that like he had like puked and shat himself, and there was all this garbage dripping off of him. It's nasty. Sorry, I'm getting too graphic maybe for some people. The child killer M, the child killer referred to as M over several episodes. So this is a character that I was a little bit confused when I first saw this character. He's slapping a girl in his car, and I thought at first it was like his child and he was just being like an overly abusive parent, but it turns out it's relating to a guy who used to kidnap small girls and of course, do unspeakable acts to them. And he was convicted, I think it was, let me read here, it says June 17th, 2008. He had killed 4 girls who were just young elementary school girls who were just simply walking home. And the scariest thing about it was that he was part of the school's PTA group and not somebody they suspected at all. And in fact, he even helped with the investigation, like looking around for these missing girls, when he was the one who had done it. And the reason they just call him M was because the real name of the guy who did it was called Miyazaki Tsutomu. Okay, just wanted to make sure I got that name right. I've got some stuff written down here to kind of reference as I go. So those are all the sort of super eerie things that go down during this show. And like I said, this is definitely a show for you to watch if you love Japanese horror. Some people are a little bit confused by the plot, but if you want, I guess, a non-spoiler synopsis, the house is a loop. The house is a a cursed loop that every family that invites itself in there goes through. And if something doesn't connect to that loop, it's eradicated by the curse of the house. There's a point where one guy immediately, and I think this happens like at the very beginning, he like fries into the road, just kind of becomes like bubbling gristle, and people were really confused by that. And it's like, yeah, because that guy didn't add into the equation of what this house does to every person it brings in. There is a family that lives in the house with a son who goes completely crazy. He drags a woman into the house, impregnates her, and makes her raise the kid in the attic. And then that kid goes on to commence the same loop once again by kidnapping another girl and living with his crazy family in the house. And this happens over and over and over and over. And that's supposed to be that the Juon loop plays out, that once cursed, always cursed. Just like the true yellow house, where I said the next family that moved in was cursed, one person murdered another. The next family that moved in, the son murdered the mom. And the next family that moved in, they both committed suicide. So 2 deaths have to happen all the time in the yellow house. And it's kind of the same thing that goes on in the Juon house. If you're confused why suddenly some people disappear or destroyed by the house, like metaphysically the house is trying to sync up the loop every time. So I hope you enjoyed that explanation today. If you haven't already watched the Juon series, I would highly recommend it. Like I said, one of the best pieces of horror I've watched in a long time. Until next time, I've been Unrested. I hope you have a great rest of the day.